Welcome to a new episode of the Tolkien Experience Podcast. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Luke.
Each episode, we share with you an interview of a Tolkien scholar or fan.
That's right. In these interviews, one of us asks our guest to respond to 6 questions that help us learn about their personal Tolkien experience.
All of this is made possible by our supporters on Patreon, so we want to thank them and encourage you to check out the community there.
We are so excited to share this podcast with you. So without any more delay, let me introduce our guest. For this episode, I am delighted to be able to talk with the creator of Diverse Tolkien. Since she prefers her anonymity, we won't be giving her name out in this episode. Instead, we'll just be using her preferred pronouns. What she has told me that I can share with you is that she's a young African-American woman who talks about Tolkien. Specifically, she focuses on the anti-blackness to be found in Tolkien's work and in Tolkien fandom. If you want to see more from her, you can find her under the Diverse Tolkien name on Tumblr and on Twitter. I am very excited about this interview, so without further ado, let's get right into our questions. So would you mind telling us how you were introduced to Tolkien's work?
Yes, okay, I will. So when I was younger, we used to listen to it, and when I say we, I mean me and my family. We used to listen to it when we would travel to see other family. And just for some context, I live in Texas, so a trip can be anywhere between 3 hours to 8 hours to 11 hours. And in those trips, my mom would play the Lord of the Rings audiobooks on tape. And wow, that was a long time ago, because it was like those little tiny miniature cassette, I guess that's what it was called, and she'd play them in the radio when radio had that option. And so between our long journeys through Texas, we were able to get through most of the books through audiobook. And of course, it was when I was younger, so I don't remember all of it, but what I do remember, that was my first exposure. And then, of course, we were exposed through the movies. And initially, I did enjoy the movies, but the movies kind of creeped me out when I was little, especially that part where Frodo is wrapped in spider webs. For some reason, I couldn't even look at that. But yes, my first introduction was definitely audiobooks and road trips.
Yeah, great. To be completely honest with you, I am terrified of spiders, and I 100% blame Tolkien for that.
Yeah, giant spiders. I don't know. That's something out of horror. I don't know where you get to thinking about something like that. That's definitely on the Lovecraft level of horrors, and he really, really knew how to scare people. And you wouldn't think going into Lord of the Rings, especially as a little kid, that you'd see giant spiders and people trapped in spiders' webs. But it was so surreal to me, and it's just the creepiest thing.
So that sounds like it might be your least favorite part of Tolkien's work. What is your favorite part of Tolkien's work?
I would definitely say The Hobbit, hands down. And I'll say books and movies. And I'm not sure if you're asking for a specific part of the books or the movies, or just in general, because I know that The Hobbit itself is incredibly broad. But I like The Hobbit, and I credit it to my Tolkien Renaissance, because I wasn't very active in the fandom in my earlier years of life, and only for at least a couple of years have I been incredibly active, and that was partly due to The Hobbit. And unpopular opinion, I love the Hobbit movies, and I think in terms of it being easy for all fans to enjoy, the Hobbit movies do a really good job at that. And for someone who's been out of the fandom for a long time, coming back into the fandom with the Hobbit movies was very enjoyable. And ever since then, it's been one of my favorite parts of Tolkien's work.
Yeah, excellent. I do think that that's something that people who have been fans for a long time and they've stayed engaged in with the fandom, it's something that sometimes is taken for granted. It's like they feel too good for the Hobbit movies almost, you know? Mm-hmm. And so I do like pointing it out that, yes, this is an inroad for new fans to come in and experience the world in a way that's exciting.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's also just very inclusive of everyone, because even though I love the Lord of the Rings movies, I also acknowledge that the Lord of the Rings movies, and I say movies because that's how a lot of people get into Tolkien's world, like in terms of accessibility. Like, well, we do have access to the books. Some people may not, and it's much easier to watch a movie than it is to read a book. But also the tone of the Lord of the Rings can be a little bit darker and a little bit dimmer for people to follow. And plus, the movie is very long. So when you have something like The Hobbit, it gives fans, especially younger fans, an ability to interact with something they may not have been able to interact with, either due to barriers in having the books with them, or not having the attention span to watch the movies, or not being able to watch the movies for whatever reason. So I think those movies really did encourage fans of all walks of life to be able to partake in the Tolkien fandom in a way that was incredibly fun, because I think the movies are very, very fun. I love them a lot.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's one thing that I really engage with in terms of using the movies to encourage people to get into Tolkien. Just as a teacher, it's a lot easier to convince a student to watch a movie than it is to read a whole book.
Yep. And I agree. And just when you even factor in attention problems and attention deficits and just processing problems. And I've said this on my Twitter before, but as someone who is autistic, watching a movie versus reading a book, I will watch the movie instead. And if I do read a book, I'll have to have the audiobook playing next to me, because oftentimes it is hard for me to process information or retain information that's just a text. I could do it, but it will take like 3 hours. And I already have to do that for my grad school books without audio assistance. So when I do read Tolkien, I have to have some sort of audiobook with me while I'm taking notes, because I think when we just solely focus on the books and make someone's status as a Tolkien fan based on how much book content they've consumed, not only does it leave out people who haven't read the books, but it leaves out people who can't necessarily read the books for various reasons. Because ideally, not everyone's going to be able to read the book, be it attention problems or mental illness or mental disorders, or even lack of education. So I think just emphasizing how much the movies help all fans get into the fandom is really important. And also realizing that, acknowledging that certain barriers prevent people from reading the books. And in a way, we should start to consider the movies as on par with the books, and if not the same, different, but nowhere near lesser than the books, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I have ADHD, and so I'm similar in that, there are those fans that reread the books every single year, and I can't do that because, I'll get 2 pages in and be like, I've read this before, and start zoning out somewhere. Yep. But I can listen to the books every year. That's certainly something I can do. And so I'm really happy that we do have all these different avenues that we can use to interact with Tolkien's work, because it does make it so much more accessible. And so I think it's a really good reminder that you pointed out that treating movies as a visual adaptation of the books is a way to be more inclusive and accepting of fans who can't engage with the texts as other people might traditionally do.
And even with movies and the audiobooks, they take on a world of their own. Like, I was listening to one of the Lord of the Rings audiobooks, and I don't even remember which one it was, but it was a part in the books where Frodo and Sam were hiding because they were watching the elves pass, and the audio had included this song that the elves are singing, and it was so pretty. And I'm like, and this is an experience you don't get when you read the book. You have to hear that, and you have to experience like that. And also acknowledging, again, not everyone can experience the audiobook, but it's also to say that another example of text not being the end all be all, I think that's how you say that. But each media stands alone very well. And I think we should consider them all to be the same level, just different, because you get a different experience with each of them.
Yeah. So in thinking about these different ways to approach Middle-earth, what has been your fondest experience thinking about your own journey into Tolkien's work and experiencing Middle-earth?
So this is going to be more about The Hobbit, not surprising since it's my favorite part. So I'll start with like two stories, actually. So the first story is when I was going to college. Me and a very close family member were going to college. And when we arrived at our apartment, we were very, very disappointed with how it looked. And I still have grievances with the management about how bad those apartments looked. But so we're coming from home to this new place that we've never been to before, are not happy in. My family's not happy about it, but they really can't do anything because they have to go and school starts that week. So as we were preparing to let our family leave, we decided to like watch a movie together to test our TV out and see if everything was working. And so the movie that came on automatically, like a sign from the heavens, was The Hobbit. And as funny as it sounded, it was the first one, and then Unexpected Journey. And so I'm pretty sure everyone who's going to be listening to this has seen The Hobbit, and I'm pretty sure you've seen it. But I related very, very heavily to to Bilbo, having this journey that he did not necessarily want to be on at first, and kind of being reluctant to go, and being coerced in a way by Gandalf to go on this journey. And if he didn't go on the journey, he had to deal with guilt for the rest of his life. So being the college student that did not want to be where I wanted to be, and could have very well gone back home if I complained enough, didn't want to be there, I felt myself really, really relating to Bilbo, and watching his struggle on TV while I was just very disappointed with where I was kind of helped me accept that, hey, this will not necessarily be a bad thing. Yeah, I'm not happy with it now, but the more I go on this journey, the more happier I'll be. And if not happy, at least I learned something. So watching The Hobbit just as my family was leaving, but also kind of catching it with them before they left, I was kind of left with this feeling of reassurance that, okay, I don't like this, but I may be able to. It's very unexpected, and I'm very hesitant and reluctant to be here, but I'll make friends and make a journey as I go through. And eventually I did, and I'm still on that journey. Different college now, but still on that journey. And I credit a lot of that positive go-get-em attitude to watching Bilbo just bite the bullet and follow the dwarf. So yes, that was one of my fondest experiences. And the other one, it's not so not as like emotional as this one, but another family trip, this time with my cousin. And it kind of follows the same unexpected journey because we were just about to go way down to the backwoods of Texas for a family reunion. So me and my cousin had rendezvoused at my grandparents' house, and for some reason half the family was not where they were supposed to be, so we were just waiting for them, and we decided to turn on the Hobbit because the Hobbit was on, because they were doing a marathon, I think on TNT. I don't know if that's a channel, but that's one of the. It's a station they always play it on. But anyway, so we were watching The Hobbit, and he likes it. He was actually the first person, one of the first cousins I went to go see Lord of the Rings with when I was younger. So he's a Tolkien fan anyway. So I remember this one was a Desolation of Smaug when things get a little bit more serious. And I think it was fitting for this occasion because I was preparing to go in the car with my cousin. And he's not a bad driver at all, but he is a very fast driver. And the destination we were going to was incredibly far. And I was a little bit nervous. And there's just that grounding factor with anything Tolkien related, but with specifically The Hobbit, since it's my go-to. And so knowing that I was about to go on this very, very long journey with my cousin in his fast car down the freeways of Texas, watching The Hobbit kind of calmed me. And then, long story short, I did not end up going with him, thank goodness. But yes, just having that to calm me down before I thought I would go with him was just very, very important to me because I have car anxiety. So I credit that to calming me down, even though I didn't have to go with him.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that I love so much about not just Tolkien or or adaptations of Tolkien, but really any really good work that we've come back to over and over again, it finds a different way to talk to us. And so in both cases, it seemed to give you comfort, but it sounds like it was in a bit of a different way each time because your situation was different.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm.
It reminds me, I was reading through The Lord of the Rings this past year with a student I'm tutoring. And just the poignant passages in The Lord of the Rings, having read it after so much hardship this last year, it gets in there and it breaks your heart, but in a good way, in a way that then it kind of helps it heal again. And so I just listening to your experiences, I just felt like, I know exactly what that kind of comfort feels like.
Yes, thank you. And I definitely second you about the passages, especially kind of they're tough, I think. And when reading his books, not only are they not an easy read, I think just because sometimes the lingo and the lexicon can be hard to understand because it's heavy emotional. I feel like every passage is doused with some sort of emotion that causes you to look at not only the book itself, but also your life in relation to the text. And reading Tolkien's work, you can't help but see how you relate to his work and what part of the story or the grander scheme of life you're a part of, because Tolkien's work is about small people fighting themselves in pretty big situations. So I don't know, every time I read his work, I find myself trying to find out how it can apply to me. I don't really have to search very hard. It just happens naturally. You always find yourself in Tolkien's world, if that makes sense.
Oh, it absolutely makes sense. I love that you picked up on that theme of the small people making a big difference. It's one of my absolute favorites. In fact, my PhD thesis, that's the title is referencing that line where it talks about, sometimes the hand of the smallest must do the work because the eyes of the wise are elsewhere. Mm-hmm. It's one of my favorite themes. But I'm really interested to hear, has the way that you've approached Tolkien's work changed over time?
Yes. And so heads up, I wrote this down because this is a long answer. And I apologize because I'll get on a little bit of a social justice soapbox. But yeah, so absolutely. So I did not at all join the fandom to talk about racism. And when I did join the fandom, surprisingly, I didn't. This is going to sound bad. I didn't really care about racism too much in Tolkien's world. So let me just say that growing up and knowing about Tolkien, I had kind of just accepted that Tolkien's worlds didn't have people like me that were portrayed in a positive light. And I kind of just rolled with it because most Black kids around me did. And my family, we're Tolkien fans and we're African American, but we also, we had to accept at a young age that we weren't necessarily going to be represented. And I guess growing up with that, given the circumstances I was in, I was fine with it. And I'll talk about the circumstances. So researching racism in Tolkien's work and the fandom is actually a way to rediscover myself as someone who is African American, and to come to terms with an identity crisis I've been having for a very, very long time until college. So a lot of this did have to be, it had to do with being autistic and Black, and being social barriers within my community that I couldn't necessarily work around, or that I couldn't work around still today. But growing up, I did find a community of Black geeky nerds, and they weren't necessarily autistic. They didn't say they were, but I think they were. And I know you can't just go diagnosing people without having a full assessment with them. But just looking at the mannerisms they had, and I could tell that they were like me, but sometimes my community is a very sociable one, and I'm glad growing up I'm able to meld into that, not necessarily without flaw, just due to me being autistic. But growing up not being able to meld into that was very, very damaging to me. And even though I had my small group of Black geeks and nerds, we were very much isolated just because of how we were and how we approached things and our lack of social skills due to what I perceived to be autism. And then at the same time, being anti-racist or having exposure to racist literature wasn't something that was accessible to me in elementary school and high school. And I'm about to go on a little social justice soapbox. So I do apologize. And I think I said that at the beginning of this, but I apologize again. So there's a lack of anti-racism in Black literature and just ethnic literature and the educational system in America. So until college, you really don't know of Black influential figures outside of Martin Luther King. And he was good because he was peaceful, or George Washington Carver, who was good because he made peanut butter. And then you have Malcolm X and the Black Panthers, who are bad because they're radicals. And of course, I went to elementary school years ago, so I'm not sure if it's changed, but I live in Texas, and Texas is a crazy state anyway. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's the same. Last I checked, Texas is having some issues with their textbooks about certain material having to do with racism. And I'm not sure if that's changed or not, but there was some debate about that. But anyway, you don't really get to experience a varied perspective of racism and anti-racism literature when you're in the elementary schools or in the middle schools or the high school. So your view of racism is very binary. Martin Luther King was good because he was compliant and peaceful and accepted what he got. Malcolm X and the Black Panthers were bad because they are radicals. And it's only when you get into college that you realize that they weren't necessarily bad and that the Black Panthers were actually a self-sufficient group for the community. But we get this follow orders and don't cause trouble and racism is dead kind of view. And being anti-racist is being compliant and not causing trouble. And we're just thankful for what we have. And when you grew up in the school system I did, which was a very, and I don't want to dog on my school system, but I kind of have to, where I was, they were unfortunately very racist. And the thing is, they didn't realize it was that kind of internalized racism and the ingrained racism you get with growing up in a racist society. So a lot of the things our professors and our teachers would do to us would be racist, but they wouldn't realize it. But unfortunately, it cost us to internalize it. And without having many Black professors with you or around you to call out racism, you just accepted things as they were. So growing up, to me, racism was dead. Racism didn't exist. Martin Luther King solved racism. And even when I would experience being profiled by cops, which happened often, I'd be followed around in supermarkets, couldn't put my hands in my pockets, and I'd have white women clutch their purses next to me. Racism was still dead to me. And unfortunately, that's just the power that education has over you, the power that this ingrained knowledge has over you. Even my grandpa would tell me stories about how awful it was for him growing up in Texas in the 40s and 60s and stuff like that. To me, racism was solved because Martin Luther King lived. And even though he was assassinated while he lived, he did good things. And that all changed when I took an African American studies class in college. And suddenly my eyes were open. Every single thing I did through the perspective of anti-racism. And it was so surprising. It was just a gradual change. And part of that had to do with the fact that I had professors that actually empowered me. And while I had a little bit of them in high school, the empowerment didn't come full force until college. And I will always be thankful to my professors for that. But I started seeing everything I consumed in terms of anti-racism because suddenly I had been empowered as a young Black African-American woman. I had been told that no, racism still exists, and let me tell you why. And now everywhere I looked, it was like, I don't know if you've seen Death Note before, but if you have, there's this thing called the Shinigami. And when they look at when the Shinigami looks at you, they can see how long you live and how long you have to live and when you're going to die, etc. It was like that for me, but except I could just see racism everywhere. I was consuming all this new literature. So unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, Tolkien happened to be the literature and the hyperfixation I had at the moment. So all these anti-racist metas, all this new history of what racism was and how racism operated in society started coming full force at Tolkien, and I just couldn't stop myself. I'm like, whoa, so much of this stuff I'm learning in class is applicable to Tolkien. So all the Tolkien media I started consuming, I had to do through a lens of anti-racism, because I had realized just how much racism was ingrained in his work. And I had started from the beginning. Yeah, I got into the fandom due to The Hobbit, but then I started getting interested in the Silmarillion, and I had vaguely been aware of it in high school, but I didn't really follow up on it, and mostly this is done out of spite because the group of kids who were into Tolkien I didn't like. So I'm like, you know what, I'm just gonna take a break from Tolkien in high school. But when I interacted with the Hobbit fandom, I started learning more and more about the Silmarillion, and so I started reading it, and God, it was a struggle, but I liked it. And just rereading it with that perspective of anti-racism that I had been afforded due to my college education, I just started analyzing the hell out of the text, and I just couldn't stop myself. And I just started finding out more and more stuff that you wouldn't necessarily be able to see unless you had certain experiences that I had, certain experiences that I were now registering as racist, because my eyes had been open and I had been able to be empowered enough to know and accept that a lot of the stuff that had happened to me in my past is racism. So yes, that's how, I know that was a long answer, but that's how my approach changed over time, and discovering myself as an African American woman, and discovering and accepting that racism didn't stop with Martin Luther King, and that we live in a racist society. I was able to look critically at Tolkien's work, and unfortunately this just happens to be something I do with every fandom. And I say unfortunately because they say that with knowledge there is power, but also with knowledge there's also this sort of obligation and also this sort of exhaustion, because the more knowledge you have about things you want to change and things you can't change, the more frustrating it becomes. And sometimes, while I really do love talking about racism, I think that many activists, and myself included, do deal with this burnout, because racism is just such a huge topic, but you also want to just enjoy fandom for how it is. And talking about racism all the time, you don't necessarily get to do that. So it's kind of a catch-22. But yeah, and what else did I write down? Because I know it was important because I wrote it down. But yeah, and all this to also say that there's a lot to say about knowledge is power, but that a lot of this knowledge that we have is not afforded to people who can't afford college, because I had to have a college education to get in the African American Studies class and to get those textbooks and to be sitting where I was sitting. But just a lot of people don't have that power, or don't have that money, don't have that education. So when you look at our society today and you see when you see racism or people not necessarily understanding why things are racism, you always wonder, well, were they afforded the education? And this is not in any way to sympathize with racists, but it's also to say that lack of education does have a lot to do with racism. And of course, we know it's not always the case, because the riots on the Capitol Hill, there were some pretty influential figures in there, but lack of education has a lot to do with racism. And long story short, I started looking at Tolkien through a racist lens when I started taking African American Studies class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that story with us. And I think it's really helpful for us for me and for people like me as white readers to understand that we are told all the time that the way that we see the text is the right way to see the text. And so just hearing how that's reinforced for someone who's not like us, someone is told that, the white way to read the text is the right way to read the text. It's really important for me to realize that I need to do a better job of listening to other interpretations and to appreciating the value that those interpretations bring, because it helps me be more aware of the role that Tolkien plays in supporting or confronting racist ideas in our culture. So that's something that I think your current work with Diverse Tolkien is really, really good at doing. would you mind telling us a little bit more about what you do with Diverse Tolkien?
Yeah, so mostly, let me not say mostly, but one of my main focuses on Tolkien's work, and with Diverse Tolkien, is analyzing Tolkien's work through an anti-racist perspective. And specifically, since I am African American, my main focus is anti-blackness within his work and how that perpetrates. For instance, I like to look at tropes that we see, anti-black tropes that we see in society, and apply those to certain aspects of Tolkien's work. So, for instance, and I didn't want to do this, I didn't want to say this because I feel like I'm going to butcher the names, but I'm going to try my best. So, for instance, like, you see the story of Eowl, Maeglin, Idril, and Ardhell, and at face value, it is just an evil elf going after a good elf, and eventually the evil elf loses. But then you break that down, you see that Maeglin and Eowl are called the Dark Elves, and we know that they're called the Dark Elves because that's the specific species they are. But you also look at the coding that comes into play and the language that comes into play. Yes, they're Dark Elves by species, but you have to look at the juxtaposition they have with, for instance, Maeglin and Idril. Idril is this beautiful, beautiful white female elf who has this white husband, and you have Maeglin, who is emphasized as being dark, that is an adversary immediately to her. So you have this dark presence as an adversary to a white presence, and that white presence happens to be a female, and that dark presence happens to be a male. And then you think about Emmett Till, this young Black African American man who went after, or was accused of going after, a white woman. All he did was whistle, and then come to find out years later he didn't even do that. But you see how this is replicated in Tolkien's work, that we see darker skinned characters, or characters who are coded to be dark. And I say coded because no, they're not. Eowl and Maeglin are not African American, but the language that comes into play and the dynamics that come into play with them versus white women, and essentially the role that coded white men play into their narrative. You see these tropes of dark-skinned people being adversaries to white women, eventually being killed off by white men. And when you take into consideration the racist and historical aspect of that, of Black men being seen as monsters and threats to white women, only to be killed off to protect the white women by white men, Maeglin's story and Eowl's story of them being two coded men going after white women only to be killed by white coded people, and Maeglin's case, a white man, you start to realize how uncomfortable that becomes. And you know that Tolkien is a very, very worldly man. He was a very, very educated man. He grew up in South Africa. He knew about the apartheid. He knew about, I know he doesn't reference it, but he had to have known about civil rights happening. He had to have known about how African Americans in America were being treated, because he was aware of racism. He was aware of the apartheid. He knew these things. I don't know if it's apartheid or apartheid or apartheid.
I typically say apartheid, but apartheid. I don't know.
But he was aware of racism, and when you take into consideration the time he grew up in, and these very, very concerning tropes of these men who are emphasized in darkness, going after these women who are emphasized to be white, only being for these men to be killed by white men, and knowing how historically versed he was, knowing the kind of man he was, you start to think, was this done on purpose? And I personally don't think so, and some people disagree with me, but I think that Tolkien was very much a product of his time, and just as racism is ingrained in society today, he could have naturally done this stuff without realizing it, because these are ideas that were echoed by the masses, that African American men of color, Black men, not even just in America but globally, were adversaries to white women. These are ideas that were replicated everywhere. So you see it in his literature, and I think I have lost the point of the question. I apologize, but you see it in his literature, that you see it and you see it in real life, and it just becomes really uncomfortable. So what I'm doing is just trying to uncover those, to uncover those racist aspects, to draw connections to them in our real life. Because I don't know, the more you look at it, the more hard it becomes to be a fan of Tolkien. I love him. I'll always be a fan of him. But my grandpa grew up telling me, he told me about how he was not able to look white women in the eye, and how every time he was on the street or on the sidewalk, he had to move away when a white woman was walking down, or that could literally mean death for him. And even today, you have like the latest story of that white woman going after that poor 14-year-old black boy for a cell phone he didn't have. You have this narrative of black men being black men being, how would you say it? Black men being adversaries to white women. And I think it's important to look at that in Tolkien's world, because people want to act like it doesn't do anything, but yes, it does. Or it doesn't mean anything. So I try to uncover these hidden messages that you really only can see from certain perspectives. And in my perspective is the African American perspective. So I apologize for the word vomit. I hope I answered the question, but that's what I do.
Yeah, absolutely. So with all of this attention to these aspects of Tolkien, I'm really interested to hear whether or not you recommend Tolkien, and why or why not.
Yes. Okay. Yes and no. So I think it's really great for everyone to enjoy Tolkien. Not only do I think he's a classic and you need to know who he is just to be able to, like, if someone's like at a party or at a social event, I wouldn't be surprised if they reference Tolkien. Tolkien's references are everywhere. So first of all, it's just good to know what Tolkien is. So when people reference it, you're just like not in outer space, but also because it's a generally enjoyable. His media is enjoyable, and I think it teaches you life lessons. And there are a lot of setbacks and failures I've had in my life that Tolkien's quotes and Tolkien's works have helped me through, especially when I have to deal with being caught between a rock and a hard place, and having to come to terms with the fact that some things I want I will never get, or some things I want I'll have to do them differently, or that things take time. I've learned lessons from Tolkien's work that I haven't been able to learn elsewhere. And books can be teachers for you, and they're teachers for you that are always there. And not only are they teachers for you that are always there, but they're teachers for you that can't necessarily critique you. They give you the work you need, but they tell you to go take with it what you will, to take our work and go do it with it what you will. There's no right way or wrong way to consume Tolkien's work or to take and internalize his message. And I think that the lessons learned in his work can be very, very beneficial, especially for people going through a hard time. I was actually doing, and I still am doing, the Tolkien fandom disability survey. A lot of the submissions I got from people were talking about how Tolkien's work had helped them through hard times, especially during this quarantine. So I think it's just like a shoulder to lean on, a metaphorical shoulder, but also just to have those life lessons in your forte when you need them. But I also say no, and this is a very, very like loose no, and I can be swayed because I don't want to like lead people to fandom where I think they won't necessarily be included. And what I mean is, like, for instance, when I started talking about racism in Tolkien, I got backlash from the get-go. I wouldn't want to tell another African American fan, hey, like, let's go to the Tolkien fandom together, only for them to notice the same things I do that are racist and to be harassed for it. Like, I wouldn't want that to happen. Or sorry, my throat's a little dry. Or when I was talking about having to have an audio aid, people were incredibly rude about that. About having to listen to Tolkien's work doesn't necessarily mean you're consuming content. So things like that, I don't want to ask people to be a part of a fandom that I don't think will be inclusive or accepting of them, because I don't want them to come in gung-ho about coming to enjoy Tolkien's work only for them to not enjoy it at the end and leave feeling bitter and angry because I led them to this fandom where they weren't necessarily happy. And I don't want them to come into a fandom and have to ask, well, where's the Black people? Are we allowed to talk about that? Or why do the elves that are described as dark do the bad things? And I know it's simplifying Tolkien's literature a little bit, but that those things are there. Like I just talked about it with Ale and Meglin, but I don't want people to have to come into a fandom and have to ask me, like, why'd you lead me to a fandom where the literature is racist and I can't even talk about it. And I also don't want people who have mental disorders and mental illnesses that prevent them from reading the text or engaging with other aspects of the work to be ostracized due to that. In fact, on my Twitter, I was scrolling this morning, as I always do, through my feed, and I saw I saw an account, and I'm not going to mention any names, tearing apart another account for using a movie quote, and to not be someone, like, if I were a fan who hadn't read the books but came in because of the movies, and I saw someone tearing apart a movie quote and calling the person who used a movie quote not a true fan, or saying they didn't know anything about Tolkien's work, I wouldn't want to be a part of a fandom like that. That told me that my love of the work or the content wasn't appreciated because I only watched the movies. Like, I'd feel so unwelcome. So I want people to be in the fandom, but I also want it to be an inclusive fandom for people where they can see themselves represented, and if they don't see themselves represented, they can also feel comfortable enough to discuss that and discuss how they can change it. So yeah.
Yeah, so I think you've mentioned some really important things there, and I agree wholeheartedly. So is there anything that you're doing right now that our listeners could get involved in or participate in with you?
Yes, actually. So I am having a Diverse Tolkien week at the end of February. Let me see. And I am totally doing it in February because it's Black History Month. So it's going to be from the 22nd of February to the 28th. And I have a prompt list currently going on Tumblr, but I'm going to move it to Twitter today. Fingers crossed, but I should. But anyway, this week is a time for people to re-envision Tolkien's work in a more inclusive way. I had done it last year or 2 years ago, I'm not sure when, but when I did it last, it was mostly an emphasis on race, but I wanted to open the floor up for suggestions as to what people wanted to see in this new Diverse Tolkien week. So I got suggestions for language, for women of color, for LGBTQ plus prompts. So this new week is way more inclusive than the last one was. And it just calls fans to re-envision Tolkien however they want to, and the bounds of those prompts that I gave them. So yes, that is the event I currently have going on, and I will hopefully be able to make a post on Twitter about it today, given that I'm able to clear my schedule. But it's a Twitter and a Tumblr event, so yes, that is what I am doing.
Fantastic. Well, this episode will probably be releasing in February, so that'll be perfect timing. So I want to thank you again so much for meeting with me today and sharing your experience. It's been a really wonderful experience.
Oh, thank you so much. I really, really did enjoy this. I enjoyed it so much.
We are so thankful that we have such gracious scholars and fans who want to share their Tolkien experience with us and with you.
We have a lot of fun making these podcasts.
Yes, we do. It's always exciting to talk to fans and scholars about their Tolkien experience.
If you want to know more about the ways to connect with this episode's guest, we provide show notes at tolkienexperience.com. Also, don't forget to check out our Patreon and to follow the podcast on your favorite social media sites.
That's right. Find us on Patreon by going to patreon.com/Tolkien Experience. We're also on Facebook as Tolkien Experience and Twitter as @Tolkien Experience. So don't forget to like, follow, share, and comment because we love interacting with you just as much as we enjoy talking to our guests. You can also follow our personal Twitter accounts. You will find me as @LukeB.Shelton.
And me as @AaronL.Palmadill. You can find the podcast on all major podcast services, including Apple, Stitcher, and YouTube.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, and we truly hope that in a way it contributes to your own Tolkien experience.